Set a record for NBA, WNBA?
Yeah, I did. I think, and she did really well against Steph too. It's hard to beat Steph, but she...
The golden hour light filtered through the tall windows of Connor McCaffery's Iowa City apartment, bathing the worn leather couch in a soft glow that seemed to freeze time, casting long shadows across the wooden floor as if the universe itself wanted to slow down and bear witness to the fragile, human moment that was about to unfold. A moment that held within it the potential to either strengthen two young souls in their bond forever or fracture the trust they had been building for years. Connor sat opposite Caitlin Clark, his hands trembling almost imperceptibly, though to him the tremor felt like an earthquake reverberating through every nerve in his body, because he knew with absolute clarity that the words forming inside his chest carried a gravity that could reshape everything they thought they knew about love, loyalty, and the meaning of being seen beyond the roles the world had forced upon them. And perhaps this is the most vulnerable truth about love itself, that it strips us down to our essence and makes us so exposed that a single question, uttered with genuine uncertainty, can hold the power to undo years of assumptions, achievements, and illusions, forcing us to confront not only how we see one another, but also how we see ourselves. And in this case, what you are about to witness is not simply the story of two college basketball stars bound together by shared experiences of victory and defeat, but the night when Connor McCaffery asked Caitlin Clark something so profoundly intimate, so terrifying in its simplicity, that her response broke him open in tears and simultaneously revealed the kind of love that transcends the fleeting illusions of fame, the crushing pressure of public expectation, and the carefully curated narratives the outside world thinks it knows about young athletes who are supposed to be invincible. What nobody outside that apartment understood at the time was that this single conversation would quietly become the foundation for a bond so unshakable, so deeply rooted in unconditional support, that it would carry them through the most painful valleys and brightest triumphs of their careers, reshaping not only their relationship, but also their understanding of what it means to be worthy of love without condition. But before we descend fully into that unforgettable April evening in 2023, let us remember the backdrop against which it unfolded, because it had been only 3 weeks since Iowa's devastating loss in the NCAA championship game against LSU, 3 weeks since Caitlin had shouldered the impossible weight of an entire season and an entire fan base only to come up just short of the ultimate prize. And though millions saw her dazzling play and heartbreaking tears, only Connor saw the private aftermath, the way she silently carried the blame for every missed shot, every turnover, every imperfect moment, as though her entire worth as a human being had been decided in 40 minutes of basketball. Yet what even Connor had not realized until that night was that Caitlin's anguish was about far more than the loss itself, because beneath the headlines, the interviews, and the endless social media commentary, she was wrestling with an unbearable question of identity, a question that gnawed at her spirit when the arena lights went dark. Was she loved, truly loved, for who she was as a person, or merely for what she could achieve on the hardwood? The quiet of the apartment was broken only by the low hum of the air conditioning and the distant murmur of Iowa City traffic drifting in through half-open windows, and Caitlin sat curled up on one corner of the couch, dressed in one of Connor's old Iowa basketball t-shirts, her hair pulled back in a messy bun that revealed not the fierce, commanding competitor who had dominated national headlines, but a young woman exhausted far beyond physical fatigue, her spirit drained by weeks of criticism, by the cruel echo chamber of strangers who felt entitled to judge her worth through a screen, and by her own relentless internal voice. In that dim light, she looked achingly human, vulnerable, almost like a child searching for refuge, and Connor, who loved her not as an icon but as the girl he had come to know in quiet moments away from the cameras, felt his heart ache with both tenderness and fear. "Kate," he said softly, using the private name he reserved for their most intimate conversations, his voice carrying the fragile gentleness of someone who knows he is about to step into sacred territory. "Can I ask you something important?" Caitlin glanced up from her phone, where she had been tormenting herself by scrolling endlessly through comments that praised and mocked her in equal measure, her defenses weary, her eyes suspicious yet trusting enough to say, of course, though something in Connor's expression, a seriousness she rarely saw in him, tightened her stomach with apprehension. "Connor, Inhale deeply, the kind of breath one takes before plunging into icy water, fully aware that when you surface, you might not be the same person anymore. And with that breath, he asked the question that had been burning in his chest for months, the question he could no longer contain. Do you think I would still love you if you never played basketball again? In that instant, the room shifted. The light itself seemed to pause, and the question hung between them like both a prayer and a dare, touching the rawest nerve of Caitlin's being. And as her phone slipped from her hands and clattered unheeded to the floor, not her boyfriend the athlete or the supportive partner, but a man laying bare his own fragility, weeping not because her answer had wounded his pride, but because it revealed the depth of her pain. And in that moment, their tears mingled into a kind of communion, a shared humanity that neither of them had ever experienced even in their greatest victories on the court. And perhaps this is the secret truth of relationships forged under the spotlight, that the world celebrates the highlight reels, the records, the dazzling performances. But what sustains real love are not the cheers or the trophies, but the nights when two people strip away everything external and dare to confront the terrifying possibility that they might be loved or unloved beyond their accomplishments. And it is in this confrontation that the possibility of unconditional love is either born or broken. For Caitlin, this conversation became the first crack in the armor she had built around herself since high school, when praise and expectation began to define her. And for Connor, it became the moment he understood that his role in her life was not to fix her fears or to erase her burdens, but to stand steady enough that she might find herself again in his presence. What neither of them fully grasped that night was that this exchange would serve as the bedrock upon which they would weather not only the highs of professional careers, but also the lows that inevitably follow, because it is not the roar of the crowd, but the quiet resilience of these private moments that determines whether love can endure. And as the April evening faded into night and the golden hour shadows gave way to darkness, they both knew, without speaking it aloud, that something had changed forever, not because the question was fully answered, but because they had dared to ask it at all. And in that daring, they discovered a love vast enough to hold even their deepest uncertainties.
Is great, but I think she does so many other things that contribute to winning basketball, so I definitely admire that.
Watch the 2023 three-point contest when she went off.
The golden light of an Iowa evening spilled through the windows of Connor McCaffery's apartment, touching the edges of a moment that neither he nor Caitlin Clark could have anticipated would become one of the most defining of their lives. Because while the world knew Caitlin as the transcendent basketball star, the record-shattering scorer, the fierce competitor who had carried Iowa to national prominence, the young woman curled up on his couch that April night was someone else entirely, stripped of the bravado and spotlight, dressed in one of Connor's old t-shirts, hair tied up haphazardly, her face shadowed by weeks of self-doubt, exhaustion, and heavy, invisible chains of expectation that fame and success had fastened around her since she was barely more than a teenager. The silence between them was fragile, punctuated only by the low hum of the air conditioning and the faint sounds of traffic from Iowa City streets below. Yet in that silence lived a storm of unspoken fears, because Caitlin had been quietly unraveling since the championship loss to LSU, replaying every missed shot, every turnover, blaming herself for outcomes no one player could control, and more than that, she had been wrestling with a deeper fear that haunted her in ways basketball fans could never imagine. That she was loved only for what she could do, not for who she was. That her entire worth was conditional on her ability to put a ball through a hoop. When Connor finally broke the silence, his voice carried both hesitation and resolve, a gentleness reserved only for her. "Kate, can I ask you something important?" And though she nodded, something in his expression made her chest tighten, as if she already knew that whatever came next would cut deeper than any question of stats, fame, or future plans. And then Connor asked it, the words tumbling out like a challenge, like a prayer. "Do you think I would still love you if you never played basketball again?" In that instant, Caitlin's phone slipped from her hands and clattered onto the hardwood floor, forgotten, as her eyes widened in disbelief and terror. Because in 6 years of stardom, no one had ever dared put her fears so plainly into words, and when she finally found her voice, it cracked like glass under strain. "I don't know. I honestly don't know," and that terrifies me." And with those words, the facade broke completely, revealing not the superstar celebrated by millions, but a 21-year-old woman who had spent so long performing perfection that she had nearly lost sight of her own humanity. "Connor," she whispered, tears sliding down her cheeks. "What if I'm not interesting without basketball? What if I'm not worth loving when I'm not scoring 30 points a game or breaking records? What if the only reason people care about me is because I can do something special with a basketball?" The rawness of her confession pierced Connor's heart, but instead of recoiling, he drew closer, taking her hands firmly in his, and in that moment, he knew that his answer had to carry more than comfort. It had to carry truth, the kind of truth that anchors love beyond circumstances, and so he said, with his own eyes wet, "Kate, I fell in love with you before I ever saw you play basketball." And the truth of this was undeniable because years earlier, long before Caitlin had become a household name, they had met in a coffee shop on campus during her freshman year, and he had been captivated not by her fame but by her laughter, her sharp intelligence, the way she talked about her family, her dreams beyond basketball, the way she leaned forward with genuine interest when listening to someone else. And he reminded her of that night, of their first real conversation that lasted hours and never once touched on basketball, a conversation about wanting to help kids who felt different, about her parents' lessons that character mattered more than trophies, about silly stories from her childhood that left him laughing until his sides hurt. "That's who I fell in love with," Connor said softly, not the player, but the person. And he began reminding her of the small, ordinary moments that revealed her heart more vividly than any highlight reel ever could. The time she carried groceries for an elderly woman at the store, the spring break she chose to volunteer at a children's hospital instead of going on vacation, the way she cried during a sad movie about a dog, the night she stayed up until sunrise helping her roommate study even though she had early practice herself. And as he recounted these memories, Caitlin was speechless, because these were the things she had forgotten about herself, buried beneath headlines and expectations. And Connor, voice breaking, added, "If you never touched a basketball again, if tomorrow you chose to be a teacher or a social worker or anything else, I would love you exactly the same, because I don't love Caitlin Clark, the basketball player. I love Caitlin Clark, the person who makes people feel seen and valued." The tears streaming down her face now were not only of pain but of release, of a kind of healing she had not realized she needed. And what she didn't know was that Connor had been preparing for this moment for weeks, watching her struggle silently, recognizing how the pressure had not just weighed on her game but eaten at her very identity, and he had resolved that she needed to hear, clearly and unequivocally, that her worth was untouchable, separate from her achievements. "Do you want to know what I love most about you?" he asked, squeezing her hands as if anchoring her to reality. "It's not your crossover, not your three-point shot, not any record you've broken. It's the way you greet the janitor